Okay, let me start reading this section. Now, here is the answer to the question, how many kinds of virtue are there? Okay. So, number one says this, that firstly, all these virtue is of one kind by reason of its own characteristic of composing. You are familiar with this term already, right? Composing, sīla. Let me look at the Pali. Yeah. Sīlana lakhanena ekavidam. It is one fold, one type in terms of sīlana, having the characteristics of sīlana, composing. Okay, so sīlana is the word for composing. Ekavidam, eka means one. Okay, ekavidam. What is the meaning of duvidam? Twofold. Virtue is described as twofold. Okay, Tividang means threefold. It could be understood as threefold or three types. It could be understood as four types. Okay, it could even be understood as five types. And there are different classifications within this twofold. It could be twofold in terms of charita and varita. It could be twofold in terms of abhisamacharika, etc. You know, it could be twofold, for example, as nisita, anisita. So we are now going to study all these different aspects. Okay, how it is onefold, how it is twofold, in what respect it is twofold. Here it says, for example, it could be twofold in terms of lokiya and lokuttara, mundane and supramundane. Okay, yeah. So in terms of composing, it is one kind. It is of two kinds, as keeping and avoiding. Keeping and avoiding. Now the word for keeping is charita. Avoiding is varita. Charita and varita. Okay. Charita means keeping. Varita, avoiding. Charita varita vasena duvidang. In terms of keeping and avoiding, it is twofold. Now what to keep and what to avoid? There are further explanations later on, but normally I think we have discussed it earlier as well, that there are precepts that you need to keep, the good virtues, right? Good qualities you need to develop and you need to preserve. Bad things you need to avoid. That is how virtue is defined, right? When you avoid being engaged in evil activities, killing, stealing, and so on the contrary, you develop a certain good qualities, metta, karuna, and so on. See? Likewise, as that of good behavior and that of the beginning of the life of purity. It is twofold in the sense of having good behavior. Good behavior is one aspect of virtue. The other is that of the beginning of the life of purity. We will come to the further discussions on these aspects. Good behavior is good behavior, right? Good actions. That of the beginning of the life of purity. So we need to understand what kind of life of purity it is talking about. The word for good behavior, the life of purity. Abhi samacharikadi brahmacharya kavasena. Abhi samacharika adi brahmacharya kavasena. So I think brahmacharya is referring to here life of purity or holy life. Okay, so one is this abhi samacharika. It is translated as good behavior. Abhi samacharika. But it is referring to minor rules here. In the Chatta Sankayana dictionary itself, it says minor duties. That means it is referring to minor virtues. And Brahmacharyaka Vasena. Brahmacharya is holy life. So the practices that contribute to the practice of Brahmacharya life, that fulfills your Brahmacharya life. As abstinence and non-abstinence, it is twofold. It could be considered as two types in terms of abstinence and non-abstinence. Virati, avirati, vasena. Virati, avirati, vasena. Something that you avoid, you abstain, and something that you do not abstain. You know, so in that sense, it is twofold. Virati, avirati. It is also twofold in terms of dependent and independent. Nisita, anisita. Now here you have two abhisamacharika adi brahmacharyaka vasena. But here is two words joined together. Nisita, anisita. So it became long. Nisita, anisita. Okay. Nisita, anisita. Nisita means dependent, anisita, independent. Nisita, anisita. In terms of temporary and lifelong, also it is twofold. Some people practice virtue or follow a brahmacharya life, virtuous life, in the sense that they take up virtue, or for example, they take up 5 precepts, 10 precepts, 8 precepts, or they become monk for a short period of time, right? But there are some who take up the practice for a lifetime. In that sense, it is kala paryanta apana kotika vasena. Kala paryanta. Kala paryanta means short time, limited time. Okay. Apana kotika. So in terms of temporary and lifelong. In terms of limited and unlimited, it is twofold. Saparyanta and aparyanta. Saparyanta, aparyanta. Limited, unlimited. Vasena, duvidam. And then final one is mundane and supramundane. Lokya, lokottara. Vasena, duvidam. Okay. So you do not have to remember all these things, all these terms, you know, but just keep in mind that virtue is defined and categorized into different categories. They are explained using these different categories, right? So maximum is fivefold. If you just can keep in mind briefly that one-fold in terms of composing, and it is also explained as twofold in terms of Lokya, Lokuttara, or if you remember some of them and their characteristics, because further explanations are provided later on. These are just listing of different categories here. That would be sufficient. Now let us come to the threefold division of virtue. Okay, threefold classification. It is of three kinds as inferior, medium, and superior. Tividang, hina. Hina means inferior. Okay. Majjhima, medium. And panita. Panita means higher or superior. Okay. So hina, majjhima, panita vasena, tividang. In terms of inferior, medium, and higher, it is threefold. Now, why one's practice of virtue is called inferior? How it could be medium, how it could be superior? The explanation is given below. We will come to that later on. It depends on with what kind of motivation you are practicing the virtue. Okay. If you take up a certain virtuous practice just to be proud of the practice, just to show that I'm a virtuous person, the other people are not. So that has a different purpose. You are categorized into a different type of virtuous person. Okay, probably an inferior one, but you are still a virtuous person, right? But if you practice virtue with the wish that you want to be reborn in a heavenly realm or Brahmaloka, or probably in your next life you want to be reborn in some countries. Now you are reborn in one country, but you want to be reborn in another country and so on, including heavens and Brahma worlds. That could be probably Majjhima Vasena, Majjhima, medium type of virtue. But if you are practicing virtue with the wish that you want to be free from samsara and you want to help other people and lead the same kind of life, that could be probably a higher form of virtue that you are practicing. See? So the practice of good qualities also differ based on our intention and motivation, what kind of intention we are having when we take up a certain good practices. Likewise, as giving precedence to self, giving precedence to the world, giving precedence to the Dhamma. In this sense, it could be threefold. You take up the practice with the idea of giving precedence to yourself. You take up the practice where you give precedence to the world. And the last one, you give precedence to the Dhamma. Attadipateya, Lokadipateya, Dhammadipateya. You are familiar with these three terms already, right? Attadipateya, Lokadipateya, Dhammadipateya. as adhered to, not adhered to, and tranquilized. Paramattha, aparamattha, and patipassadi. In this sense also it is threefold: adhere to, not adhere to, and tranquilized. In terms of purified, unpurified, and dubious, it is threefold: purified, unpurified, and dubious. Visuddhi, Visuddha, Avisuddha, and Vematika. Dubious means doubtful. Doubtful if it is pure or impure. As that of the trainer, that of the non-trainer, and that of the neither trainer nor non-trainer, it is threefold. Are you familiar with these terms, trainer, non-trainer? Seka, Seka, Aseka, Nevaseka, Naseka. Now, Sekas are beings that are not yet Arahant. Okay? Once you become Arahant, you are called Aseka. Below Arahant, if you belong to the other categories of being, noble being, Sotapatti Magga, Sotapatti Phala, Anagami Magga, Anagami Phala, Sakadagami Magga, Sakadagami Phala, and also Arahatta Magga. You are still Aseka, you are a Seka trainer. You have to go through a certain training still. You become Aseka only when you become an Arahant. Then you say that you have done whatever you are supposed to do. You have completed your duty. There is nothing more to do for you. You are a liberated being. Okay. Seka, Aseka, Nevaseka, Na Aseka. It is a third category. Okay. Now, virtue could be of four kinds: partaking of diminution. How do you read this? Of stagnation, of distinction, of penetration. Chatubidang, Hanabhagya, Hanabhagya, Hana, Hanabhagya, Thitabhagya, Visesabhagya, Nibbedabhagya. Bhagya means partaking to or belonging to. Bhaga means part. Okay. Connected with, conducive to, partaking to. So partaking to diminution, partaking of diminution, partaking of stagnation, partaking of distinction, partaking of penetration. Likewise, as that of bhikkhus, of bhikkhunis, of the not fully admitted, of the laity. Virtue of the bhikkhus, virtue of the bhikkhunis, virtue of the not fully admitted, that means novice, samanera. Okay, they did not get full ordination yet, and virtue of the laity, lay person. So in this sense also, it could be seen as four types. Bhikkhu, Bhikkhuni, Anupasampanna. Anupasampanna means not fully ordained. Anupasampanna. And then Gahatta sīla. Gaha, house. Gihi, layperson, householder. Gahatta sīla, laity. As natural, customary, necessary due to previous causes. Is fourfold as natural, pakati, customary, achara, achara dhammata, ubbahetuka. Pakati, achara, dhammata, ubbahetuka. Pakati, achara, dhammata, ubbahetuka. Next one is, it is fourfold in terms of virtue of patimukha restraint, virtue of restraint of sense faculties, virtue of purification of livelihood, and that concerning requisites. Now this is very, very important, number 17, because most of the discussion on the practice of virtue in Visuddhimagga that we are going to study very soon is explanation of these four types specifically. Of the other different types, there are some discussions, but there is a great discussion especially on these four types of virtue. Okay, Patimukha Sangvara Sīla, virtue of Patimukha restraint, Indriya Sangvara Sīla, restraint of sense faculties, Ajiva Parisuddhi Sīla, virtue of purification of livelihood, and Pachaya Sannissita Sīla, virtue concerning requisites. Four requisites. Yeah. So if you look at this itself, you would see that this is particularly focused on the practice of virtue by monastic members who take up the practice seriously because they want to progress in their path to liberation. Virtue could be of 5 kinds. It is of 5 kinds, as virtue consisting in limited purification, etc. For this is said in the Visuddhimagga, 5 kinds of virtue. Virtue consisting in limited purification, virtue consisting in unlimited purification, virtue consisting in fulfilled purification, virtue consisting in unadhered to purification, virtue consisting in tranquilized purification. Okay, so these are 5 types. And then you have, in terms of abandoning, refraining, volition, restraint, and non-transgression, it is 5-fold. Yeah, so this until 19 is the classification of virtues. One-fold, two-fold, three-fold, four-fold, and 5-fold. Just to keep everything in one place, you can make a chart just for your own knowledge, or just to check whenever you need to No. You can do like this. You can even put Pali word as well. Life of purity, beginning of the holy life, or life of purity. So this way you can list down in one place. If you want, you can put Pali word as well. Charita, Varita. So it would be easier for you to look at all the classifications in one place. Okay, now let us look at the explanation of each different types one by one. Okay, starting with passage number 26. Now I would have to ask you to read. Who would want to read first? Maybe I would go to Venerable Chun first. Chun is keeping silent. Can you clearly see my screen?
Yes, teacher.
Yeah. Yeah, can you start reading from this section?
Here in the section dealing with that kind, the meaning should be understood as already stated.
Yeah.
In the section, okay.
Yeah, in the section.
In the section dealing with that of two kinds, fulfilling, attend,
training
attending,
precept,
training, precept announced by the Blessed One. Thus, this should be done is keeping, not doing what is prohibited by him. Thus, this should be not done is avoiding. The word meaning is this. They keep Jaranti, within that they
they
people
proceed as people who
they
fulfill the
proceeded
virtues.
as who fulfill the virtue. Thus it is keeping Charita. They preserve, they protect avoidance. Thus it is avoiding. Herein keeping accomplished by faith and energy, avoiding by faith and mindfulness. This how it is of two kinds as keeping and avoiding.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. Yeah. So the first one, as one kind, is already stated above. So there is no further discussion on that. Okay. It should be understood as it is explained above in terms of composing, right? Now there is a discussion on virtue as two kinds, charita and varita, keeping and avoiding. In what sense it is keeping, in what sense it is avoiding. So it says that when you are fulfilling a training precept announced by the Buddha, thus, when the Buddha says in different suttas, when he was giving teaching to the monks or to the followers, when he says that, this should be done, this is how you should do this. So when you find this kind of statement there, referring to a particular practice, says that those practices should be kept. Kept means those should be practiced. Okay, not doing what is prohibited by him. Thus, this should not be done. You should not do this. You should not engage in these activities. That should be understood in terms of avoiding. Now, if you remember this verse in the Dhammapada, Sabba papasa akaranam kusalasa upasampada, right? Sabba papasa akaranam, when he says Sabba papasa akaranam, it means he is saying that do not do any kind of papa, evil actions. Try to avoid them, right? So that should be understood as avoiding. He is asking a certain actions to avoid. Evil actions. Now, what are these evil actions? Of course, there are explanations on this, right? And when it says Sabha papasa karanam kusalasa upasampada, engage in kusala actions, right? So that is something that should be kept or practiced. Something should be avoided, something should be practiced. So here in the word meaning, it says that they keep, within that they proceed as people who fulfill the virtues, thus it is keeping. Who are these? Who are they here? Practitioners, monks, those people who get instruction from the Buddha, followers, disciples. They keep a certain virtues and they fulfill the virtues. Thus, it is said to be keeping. So they preserve the virtue, they protect them, and then they avoid a certain type of virtue. That is how it should be understood as avoiding. Keeping and avoiding. And furthermore, it says that to practice those virtues that are categorized as keeping, you need to have faith and energy, saddha and virya. Why do you want to uphold a certain virtue? If you are not convinced to the qualities of those virtues. So you have to have faith, conviction, or saddha. And of course, you have to use your energy or virya. So virya is all the time necessary. Virya, mindfulness, they are all the time necessary in your spiritual practice. If you look at the explanation of virya, for example, it says that you have to use your effort to avoid unwholesome actions that are arisen in your mind. You have to make effort to stop arising unwholesome actions. So one is that you have to make effort to to be free from the unwholesome thoughts that are arisen in your mind. The other is you have to make effort to stop arisen unwholesome thoughts to arise. Again, you have to make effort to develop the wholesome thoughts that have arisen in your mind. And the other effort is that you have to make effort to arise unarisen wholesome thoughts. So effort is important. And avoiding, you practice avoiding by faith and mindfulness. Okay, so faith is a common factor in both cases, keeping and avoiding. But in keeping, you have one more factor, that is energy, whereas in avoiding, you have to be mindful. This is how it is of two kinds as keeping and avoiding. Okay. Now, how it is of good behavior and that of the beginning of the life of purity or holy life. Right. Now let's look at this passage. Now Grace has to read.
Yes, teacher, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
In the second diet, good behavior is the bystand of behavior. Good behavior itself is that of good behavior. Of what announced for the sake of good behavior is that of good behavior. This is virtue other than that, which has livelihood. As eighth, it is the initial stage of the life of purity, consisting of the life of purity. This is a term that has livelihood as eighth. It is the initial stage of the. Sorry, teacher, I can't see the screen. Okay. It is the initial stage of the path because it has actually to be purified in the prayer stage too. Hence, it is said that his bodily action, his verbal action, and his livelihood have already been purified earlier. Or the training precepts called lesser and minor are that of good behavior. The rest are that of the beginning of the life of purity, or what is included in the double code, the bhikkhus and the bhikkhunis, patimokkha, is that of the beginning of the life of purity, and that included in the duties set out in the kandakas of Vinaya is that of good behavior. Through its perfection, that of the beginning of the life of purity comes to be perfected. Hence it is said also that these bhikkhus shall fulfill the state consisting in the beginning of the life of purity without having fulfilled the state consisting in good behavior. That is not possible. So it is of two kinds, that of good behavior and that of the beginning of the life of purity.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, so this is the explanation of these two types.